that he saved that for a campfire, not for a court of law.
Sources say, aside from the cult theory, Peterson's attorneys are looking at other leads.
The theories were so crazy. It could be a Hawaiian crime gang, it could be dope dealers, it could be a hooker stealing checks, it could be burglars, or it could be a satanic cult. And the more those arguments were made, the more obvious it was that Scott Peterson did it, because every other argument seems so outlandish.
The public as a whole, you don't, well, and even as a family member, you don't want to think that those things go on. You don't want to think that there's that kind of evil out there. And I think it created this perception that somehow the defense is grasping at straws.
Objection, that calls for speculation. It borders on the ludicrous.
But Janie claimed her reporting was inaccurate and, coupled with shoddy police work, helped convict Peterson in the court of public opinion.
And he's on death row because he asked Gloria Gomez to take her shoes off.
But at the end of the day, that body was discovered where Scott Peterson went fishing. That you cannot deny.
This is all about building doubt. So if there are enough doubts that are put out there, maybe a juror will think, okay, the prosecutor has not proved his case.
When it came time for the defense case to start, everyone was expecting all this evidence to come forward, and very little of it did.
Is that someone else, yet to be found, committed this crime.
The most likely thing that happened is that she was abducted, and she was abducted by someone other than my client, and that she was abducted while walking her dog.
You have to believe that he's, dragging his wife's dead body out of their house and putting it in the bed of his pickup truck in broad daylight. And it just, there's nothing about this case that makes sense.
Why do you believe that Laci was alive on the morning of December 24th?
There were over 14 witnesses who reported seeing Laci and/or Mackenzie walking in the neighborhood.
14 witnesses that said, I saw Laci Peterson that morning and/or Mackenzie the dog.
They are tips that were called into the tip line. Some of them aren't specific saying they saw Laci, but they're saying they saw a pregnant woman.
Well, that's different than what you said.
Retriever.
You said you had 14 witnesses that saw Laci that morning, and that's not true.
Okay, you have 14. The problem is they weren't ever interviewed properly to determine whether or not they had seen Laci.
That is not a matter of record. There are 14 witnesses that said they saw what they thought was maybe a pregnant woman or an overweight woman walking with a large dog.
Mm-hmm.
That's a long way from saying, I saw Laci Peterson with Mackenzie the dog.
They are tips that were called into the tip line.
If those things are impossible, then this man murdered Laci Peterson.
It was an explosive day for the prosecution, giving the defense a taste of their own medicine.
The judge let the prosecution play by the rules Garagos was playing by.
Lead prosecutor Rick DiStasso dropped a bombshell tip from a man claiming to be Scott Peterson's college friend. He said the two talked about how to get rid of a body. They would wrap the body in duct tape, wrap cement weights around the head and hands, throw it in the sea where the fish would eat away at the neck, leaving no identity on the body. Turns out, though, the tip was bogus, a red herring, yet the jury got to hear it anyway.
Garagos was able to bring in tips, uncorroborated, according to the prosecution, not good tips, while the prosecution got to do the same thing today.
Rick DiStasso, for the first time, challenged Mark Garagos, and he won. He got in evidence in front of that jury that never should have been seen.
Legal experts say DiStasso made a big point at the expense of the defense.
If, as the defense argues, the prosecution was trying to frame Scott Peterson, obviously this witness who made this highly incriminating statement would be their star witness. They could frame him very easily if they wanted to, but that's not what they're doing.
We're talking with Janie Peterson, who's a sister-in-law to Scott Peterson. Janie, let me ask you then, is what you think happened is that she confronted the robbers and that she was kidnapped and held for a time potentially and then killed with her and, their son's body dumped in the bay? Is that kind of a very simplified version, but is that what you think happened?
There's more evidence that happened than there is evidence that Scott murdered Laci and Connor. And until it's, properly investigated, when you're on the defense side of things, when you're a defendant and you're hiring private investigators, how you can investigate a crime is not even close to the resources that a police department has or the government has to investigate a crime. So, we're having to come at this from a very different angle and perspective than if the Modesto police would have done it right the first time.
Objection. That calls for speculation. It borders on the ludicrous.
I am a timeliner. I've always thought sequentially. So I think ultimately that was probably where it started with me, just trying to piece together the day. The biggest part of what we have in the Scott office is a timeline of December 24th. That kind of takes over one wall.
Okay, maybe Laci, who was walking the dog, came across this burglary.
And maybe they were carrying a TV set into the van or something like that. And she says, hey, what are you doing there? I'm calling the police. And they panic. And they grab her. Dog gets loose, runs away. They put her in a van. And it's a stupid, panicky thing to do, but they do it.
So the defense in this case was that Scott Peterson didn't do it.
Objection. That calls for speculation. It borders on the ludicrous.
Then the question becomes, how do the bodies get to the Berkeley Marina? And that one, to me, is the easiest one. I think the burglars are probably initially panicked, kept her for a while, and then the realization hits them that they can't let her live because now they've committed kidnapping. And now we're not talking about a burglary for a year or two in jail. We're talking about, life in prison. And so they say, we got to get rid of her. And someone says, yeah, but what do we do with the body? And they say, hey, you know what? Everybody in the country knows that Scott Peterson went to the Berkeley Marina. Let's drop the body there. That was the one smart thing that they came up with.
That it's just not credible. It's either someone actively framed Scott Peterson after kidnapping his 8-month pregnant wife, or he did it. That's it.
There was 2 separate, really strong pieces of evidence that worked together. The fact that the bodies were in the bay where Scott put himself. And the other significant aspect about that is Scott predicted that this was going to happen to Laci weeks before it happened. When he met with Amber Fry at the beginning of December.
This has to be the biggest coincidence I've ever heard of. I mean, are you psychic? I mean, you predicted your wife would be missing?
All bets were off.
Oh, yes, you said you've lost your wife.
No.
Yes. Obviously, without me saying much. But we were...
I said that I lost my wife.
Yes, you did.
I did, and yes.
How did you lose her then, before she was lost? Explain that.
There are different kinds of loss, Amber.
Telling his girlfriend he lost his wife? That's a tough piece of testimony to overcome.
By the close of the evidence in the guilt phase, I remember most people around me thinking, and I too thought, 12 jurors are not going to acquit him.
There was a lot of evidence against Scott Peterson, all right? It was a circumstantial evidence case, but that doesn't mean it was weak. It was a very strong, powerful, compelling case.
We, the jury in the above entitled cause, find the defendant, Scott Lee Peterson, guilty of the crime of murder of Laci Denise Peterson.
You know, I'm probably even more firm now in my conviction that Scott Peterson is guilty than I was at the time of the trial. The man is where he belongs to be. And if you were to ask my 11 fellow jurors, they would tell you the same thing, I'm sure. Although we haven't spoke with each other for some time, I have stayed in touch with a few. But it is an awesome responsibility to have a person's life in your hands. And, we don't normally, the average citizen normally, they'll never get that opportunity. And they should thank good Lord that they don't.
Well, we thank you.
Because it's something you don't want to do.
We thank you, Mike. We thank you for you and your fellow citizens on that jury. Mike Belmessieri, thank you so much.
I think the reason Scott Peterson doesn't admit that he killed his wife and unborn child is it's not a role that he finds particularly appealing. He prefers the role of wrongfully accused man who might someday be free.
I mean, if it was my child, that would be extremely difficult to deal with, but he's not my child. Because he murdered my child. So as far as I'm concerned, he's where he needs to be.